Welcome back to another American Reacts. Ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at why is Australia's biggest herbivore so strange. I believe this is going to be talking about the kangaroo and similar animals of the like. The kangaroo is very unique, and you guys in Australia that are watching this, you're probably like, what the heck? You know, you see them every day. They're not strange to you, but keep in mind, they are strange to the rest of the world, literally. It's so bizarre. I've said it a million times how there are so many animals, almost this own animal kingdom in Australia that's different than the whole rest of the world. This video comes to us from Mothlight Media. Hopefully we can learn some more in depth about kangaroos and their history in this video, and a little dip into Australia's wildlife and how it differs from here in Americas and beyond. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this started.
All of the world's continents and ecological regions have their own large herbivore, like bison, elephants, and the guanacos and tapirs in South America.
Yeah.
Despite the many differences between each of the continent's largest animals, they are all at least partly hoofed, four-legged, and move around by walking or galloping, which is what you would expect for large animals. But in Australia, evolution took a very different turn, as the largest herbivore on the continent is the red kangaroo, which stands on two legs and move around by hopping, which is the complete opposite of what you would think would be beneficial for a large herbivore. So why did these herbivores evolve so differently than on any other continent?
So weird, right? So weird when you look at them compared to the other continents.
Although the kangaroos are the largest animal in Australia today, this has only become the case relatively recently. About 30 to 40,000 years ago, like many other places around the world, Australia had its own giant Ice Age era beasts, the largest of them being an animal called Diprotodon.
Wow.
Diprotodon was significantly larger than kangaroos, as it may have been able to grow to the size of a rhino. And it wasn't just the largest Australian animal at the time, but the largest marsupial known to have ever lived. Diprotodon wasn't closely related to kangaroos, and was actually more closely related to wombats, and like them, it walked on all fours. So in the not too distant past, Australia's largest animals didn't hop. So some of the reason that Australia's largest animal is so strange will be down to this fairly recent extinction of some of its largest animals. However, even among similarly sized herbivores in other parts of the world, the kangaroo's way of movement is still unique.
Yeah, it is.
The largest animal outside of Australia that move in a similar way are the spring hares in Africa, that barely weigh more than a few kilos.
Way smaller,
so it seems strange
though, yeah.
that an animal would have retained the ability to hop while evolving to get so large. But surprisingly, two legs actually works really well for kangaroos, as they actually use less energy while running than many other similarly sized mammals.
I suppose.
Kangaroos...
I mean, when you watch them hop around, it's so funny, right? It's almost like cartoonish. But they literally do that. That's how they move around. But when you look at, I gotta admit, when you kind of think on paper, like hopping around, it doesn't seem like it'd be smooth and I guess you could argue like a sustainable way of getting around. But it really works for them. And I got to admit, they do it pretty gracefully, right? They hop around and they kind of glide across the floor, right? You see them get going really fast and it works for them. It's more graceful in a way than the four-legged animals, right? They use all fours. And so, with that point, it's pretty interesting to hear that they indeed use less energy doing so. Then, of course, another animal that would be using all fours and moving around at a fast pace. It's I don't know. It's very bizarre. Very bizarre.
And Australia's other hopping marsupials were once maligned as being more primitive than the mammals in the rest of the world, and that their ability to hop around was a symptom of this. However, this is now widely disregarded. Hopping around might seem quirky, but that's only because so few animals outside of Australia travel like this. And even though it may not look like it, hopping is actually highly efficient. Unlike humans and other mammals that jump using a lot of muscular effort, a kangaroo's legs are shaped so that when their heel strikes the ground, their Achilles tendons are stretched out, storing some of the energy from the last hop. That when they contract, propel them into the air like a spring. Meaning that once they get up to speed, they only have to input a small amount of muscle force into each new hop.
That's what's crazy. I mean, we're almost talking like mechanical. It's almost like mechanical, like a, suspension on a car or a vehicle of some sort, right? They're not using all this muscle right here, even though they are pretty muscular. I mean, look at those hind legs. They do have some muscle going on when they need it, right? But for their regular hops, hopping around, they're not using all of this. It's literally these tendons expanding so hard, and then they can contract and springboard them forward. Like I said, it's crazy. It's super cool. And the fact that this is a regular, animal that has this almost mechanical type way of getting around, it's really fascinating. It really is.
As a lot of the force was retained from the last jump. To get up to speed, they only have to input a small amount of muscle force into each new hop, as a lot of the force was retained from the last jump, like a bouncy ball. Most animals, including humans, expend more and more energy the faster they travel, but because of their legs, once kangaroos get up to speed, the amount of energy they use doesn't change very much or can even decrease. And interestingly, studies have shown that for the largest two-legged animals that hop, kangaroos and wallabies, the hopping process may be even more efficient relative to their size than some of the smaller marsupials. But hopping also has disadvantages as well, which may be the reason that it is so rare, especially outside of Australia. Kangaroos are very efficient while cruising at a moderate speed, but use more energy than walking while moving slowly. Plus, stability can be an issue for hopping animals when the ground isn't flat, which actually makes sense in Australia because it is the flattest continent in the world.
True.
So despite the kangaroo's appearance, their hopping is actually quite efficient. But this doesn't necessarily even really matter. The largest animal will usually be a reflection of the animals that are already living in that ecosystem, and so it is largely down to chance. Animals will generally trend to get larger over time, provided that it doesn't hinder them in other areas, and that there aren't animals already filling the niche, as being really big is one of the best defenses for survival. But they will eventually reach a limit at the point where they are unable to gather enough food in their ecosystem to sustain their body mass. So the larger animals in any given ecosystem are largely due to what animal occupied the niche first. However, the largest animal in a specific environment will nearly always be herbivorous, because they have access to higher amounts of food. Because predators are secondary consumers, they get their energy from plants that have already been eaten by their prey, which means the vast majority of energy that a predator's prey eats doesn't pass on to the predator. This means that predators will always have less food available, and so they will almost always run into their size limits much earlier than a herbivore would. In Australia, there are and were many herbivorous animals that travelled around by hopping on two legs, or at least hopping on two legs is a much more common way for animals to get around in Australia than it is almost anywhere else. So it was much more likely that one of these animals was going to evolve and fill the niche of a large herbivore in Australia than in other parts of the world. Two-leg hopping would only have to be good enough and not necessarily perfect. Not very long ago, kangaroos had a much larger relative called Procoptodon, or the giant kangaroo, that went extinct about 15,000 years ago. Procoptodon was only slightly taller than a modern-day kangaroo, standing around 2 meters tall, but had a much heavier build, weighing around 200 to 250 kilos. Like a kangaroo, Procoptodon had very large hind legs and almost certainly walked bipedally. But there are many differences in their limb bones and other aspects of their morphology that has led researchers to believe that these large beasts had lost their ability to hop. And this makes sense, seeing as the way that kangaroos get around causes enormous stress on their muscles and tendons. Kangaroos manage by having absolutely massive tendons in their heels, but eventually a large enough body will become too taxing on the animal for this way of movement. So the Procoptodon had evolved to the point where hopping was no longer a good way for them to move around.
That's pretty interesting. So kangaroos, what you can take from that are just the sweet spot. They can get pretty big, like the red kangaroos, but that's about maxed out for their genetic ability, like their body, right? Procoptodons, we're going to look those up real quick because that's just interesting. I never knew about that. Like you said, these aren't terribly tall, not too much taller than, a modern day like red kangaroo. But they definitely are more built. You can see like even down into the lower leg, they're just very thick, right? Very built. And I suppose that's very taxing on their ligaments, right? Especially down here. The head shape is a little different, right? You can kind of see there a lot thicker than a kangaroo. Kangaroos are, I don't know, like a lot of them are muscular, but they're still pretty lean, right? And that's why they've evolved better and why those are extinct. They're just leaner and more agile, Oh, look at that rendition of one. Jeez, they were pretty built, pretty buff. Wow, but it just couldn't last. Weird head, right? Weird head, almost more of like a, like a bull mastiff, like dog head. you know, rather than a slim, longer head of a kangaroo.
But still lived and at one point thrived in Australia, walking on two legs, simply because they had ancestors that moved this way. However, this isn't the whole story, because why does Australia have so many bipedal hopping animals for this to have happened in the first place? This isn't entirely understood, but the easiest explanation would be that it was because hopping is more energy efficient. Most two-legged hopping animals, including the few placental animals that travel this way, live in arid environments, so it makes sense why they would need to move as efficiently as possible, and why many of them have evolved in Australia. However, the problem with this is that at the moment studies have only shown better efficiency in large animals like kangaroos and wallabies, and small rodent-sized two-legged hopping animals don't seem to have any energetic advantages over similar-sized four-legged animals.
Wow.
Adding to this, the only reason this method of travel is more efficient is because of the incredibly specialized spring-loaded legs that these animals have, that would have had to evolve first in order to gain the advantages of hopping. So why did these animals adapt this way in the beginning? Another explanation is that the origin of moving by hopping came from small animals so they could better evade attacks from predators. At least among rodents that hop on two legs, they are actually better at avoiding attacks from predators than their other quadruped rodents. So it is possible that small hopping animals evolved powerful hind legs in order to leap out of the path of an attacking predator.
Okay.
But over time, as they became more hind leg dominant, perfected the art of hopping on their hind limbs. So hopping may be rare, but it isn't necessarily any worse than walking or galloping to get around, and instead, like most things, has its advantages and disadvantages, even for large animals.
So that's pretty interesting roundup there, right? For one, a lot of evolutions come from avoiding predators, right? So it makes sense that a two-legged animal would hop away, be able to jump, hop, you know, do all these maneuvers better to get away from a snake or something like that. Much easier than a four-legged one that's just down on the ground, more vulnerable, and can't really do much maneuvers other than, you know, move laterally or whatever on four legs. And then, of course, like he said, Australia, you know, technically is the flattest continent, and so they have a better chance of being on easy, you know, easier terrain to hop around on. It's not like it's, you know, like Tibet or Nepal or something where it's like totally mountainous and there's like literally no flatness at all. You know, obviously they could not hop around that kind of terrain. And, you know, they need to be energy efficient, right? If they live in some dry parts, I mean, Australia is pretty damn dry in parts, right? And very, very arid. So, yeah, they need to be efficient. They can't be using tons of energy when there's not a lot of water and, you know, resources around. So, all this does make sense, but it's interesting to see, and I never really thought about it, other than I just think kangaroos and a lot of Australian animals are so unique, but especially these hopping marsupials, they're just so different than anything else around the world. But these reasons make sense, and it points to how unique Australia is. So if you watching this and you live in Australia, and perhaps maybe you've never gotten a chance to travel outside of Australia, you know, go to Europe, go to Asia, go to the Americas, right? Go to Africa. You know, I can tell you, even though I haven't gotten to travel that much either, but, you know, I could safely say, at least even from the Americas standpoint, it's a lot different. Australia, like I've always been learning here, it's just so different. So if you're from there and haven't gotten to see anywhere else, you'd be in store for a lot of change. And vice versa. If I went to Australia, which I definitely want to and plan to, it would be a lot different. There's just a lot of things that are different, and it's very unique. It's very cool.
How animals have evolved differently in Australia due to its isolation, with some surprising advantages to hopping on two legs, saw large animals in Australia evolve to move very differently to almost anywhere else in the world. Thank you for watching.
That's
bizarre.
bizarre.
A big thank you goes to all my patrons, especially...
That was the end. So make sure to check out the link in the description down below. That is for this video from Mothlight Media. And with that being said, guys, leave your comments down below. Have you ventured out? Did you notice a big change in landscapes and most of all wildlife, you know, different animals, things like that? That would be one of the biggest differences right away. That's what makes Australia so unique. And even, you know, seeing differences if you've traveled, you know, between maybe like Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. That's something that really interests me because I remember when I first started learning, I didn't realize all the differences there was. I really never thought about that my whole life. And of course, do throw a thumbs up on this video if you enjoyed it. And maybe if you learned something, It does help the video out a lot. Subscribe for more videos like this. Of course, check out the description for this original video and other ways you can support my channel. My name is Ian. You're watching IWrocker. Until next time, guys. Catch you later.